Well, hello and welcome back to Steve's Lovely Loaves Introduction to Sourdough Baking class. I'm Steve, and this is the first of what I think is going to end up being a lot of videos on how to make sourdough bread. I do a face-to-face class. I do several face-to-face classes on all kinds of things to do with baking and sourdough bread. And even though it's a 4-hour class and I cover a lot of information in that class, there's a lot of information that I don't have time to include, a lot of detail that I'd like to be able to go into that I just don't have time to do. And although I give plenty of room for questions and so on, and we have a great time and it's very hands-on and people learn a lot through that, there's also a place for having a step-by-step series of instructional videos, for instance, to go into each and every component of that process and what I teach, and go into maybe a little bit more detail. Now, another advantage of doing this on the school platform is because we actually are building a community of people, not just viewers, so that you can actually interact with me and you can ask questions even after I've done the video, and we can all work together to improve our bread making. So this is the first video. It's all about sourdough starter. It's probably the foundation. It is the foundation of your sourdough bread making. And so I'm going to go into detail about what is a sourdough starter and how you make a sourdough starter, then how to use a sourdough starter to get the best quality bread, and how to maintain it so that you'll have it for as long as you want to be baking for, and also how you can create a backup reserve. For instance, if something drastic goes wrong and your starter gets destroyed, or whatever, it dies or whatever, which is very hard to do, by the way, but people manage to do it. So welcome to this series of classes, and I hope that you get a lot out of it, and please let me know what you think as we continue on, and any suggestions you've got, I'm more than happy to listen to. Okay, so what's a sourdough starter? We all have an idea, and a lot of people would know what that is, but what is it essentially, and why is it so much better in so many ways for making good quality bread than, say, just buying yeast and using yeast to make your bread? Well, in actual fact, sourdough starter and yeast aren't all that different. The main difference is that the yeast that's used in commercial yeast that you buy from the supermarket or wherever, and usually these days is in a dry form, although you can get it in a fresh, compact form as well. It's a single strain of the same yeasts that are found in a natural sourdough starter. It's Saccharomyces cerevisiae is the actual name of the particular strain of yeast that is used in commercial yeast, and basically it's brewer's yeast, and it's very, very effective at turning starches and sugars into the products that are needed to ferment and in this case create bread. So the baker's yeast is very good at creating lots of air and bubbles, as the yeast, when it's combined with water in an environment where there's lots of starches and lots of sugars, which there are in wheat flour, for instance. They are very efficient at metabolizing and ingesting that starch particularly, and producing gases from that, mostly carbon dioxide and a bit of water as well. But that's what they do, and they do it extremely well. So it only takes a little bit of yeast in that environment of a mix of flour and water, and they quickly begin to metabolize that food in this case, and they grow in number extremely quickly, and they create a lot of air, and it's that air that's, if we retain it within the dough that we make, that causes the bread to rise. But in commercial yeast, that's about all it does. There's not a lot else that it does. Whereas in a sourdough starter, you've got other microbes in that environment as well. Because what you're doing when you make a sourdough starter is that you're taking flour and you're taking water and you're mixing them together, and you're just allowing the natural yeasts and bacteria that are in the air and also present within the flour and the water even to come in and to find a home within that mix. And over a period of time, those natural yeasts and bacteria that like that starchy, wet environment, in this case with bread flour, and also the proteins and the glutens as well, they find that environment very, very beneficial. They begin to multiply. They produce byproducts, which is not only the gases and the water, but in the case of also bacteria, they produce acids and alcohol and other things as well. So in that wild yeast environment and wild culture environment, you've got a lot more things going on. And what that tends to do is it imparts a more complex flavour profile. It tends to, because that natural culture produces more of an acid than what your commercial yeast does, it creates a more of a sour flavour, which a lot of people like. But it also does things like, over time, with a long period of allowing that fermentation to happen, it breaks down a lot of the toxins and unhelpful, indigestible elements within the flour and makes them more digestible. Also, it over an extended period of time, it even breaks down the gluten to a degree, and that also makes the gluten more digestible. So the advantage of a sourdough is that because it takes a long time for that process to work, as opposed to yeast, which is very quick, you get all those other benefits, and that's why sourdough bread is often a lot easier to digest, tastes great, and is really, really a lovely bread all round. Okay, so with your sourdough starter, what you're doing is you're creating a concentrated environment whereby you've got that matured mix that's been developed over a period of time, and you've got it ready for when you mix it in with your flour and water and make a bread. It immediately begins to work, and it's gone through a process of cleansing, because what happens is that when you invite all of the bacteria and yeast and so on that is present when you make up your sourdough starter, you've got good guys, which is the yeast and some of the bacteria, but you've also got some bad guys. And don't you all know that not every bacteria out there is friendly, but they all get into that mix initially when you make your sourdough starter. So what we need to do is to, over a period of time, allow that starter to create an environment that will eventually sort of weed out the bad guys and be friendly for the good guys. And that's one of the amazing things about the fermentation that we're doing, is that's exactly what happens. There's certain bacteria that create acids. The acids in that, through that process, they are unfriendly to a lot of the nasty bacteria, and but the acid environment is created by bacteria that are friendly to us. So that's essentially what you're doing when you're creating a sourdough starter, because otherwise what you could do is just mix flour and water, let it ferment until it's sort of fermented, bubbly and so on, and you could use it straight away. But if you do that, you're going to end up with a problem, because there's a lot of bacteria that are producing toxins that aren't really good for us. So in actual fact, sometimes it makes the situation worse than it does make it better. Okay, so let's go through the process then of how you actually make a sourdough starter. Okay, so we want to make a sourdough starter. All we basically need to do to kick the process off, and this is a process that's going to take a minimum of 10 days to actually reach a mature sourdough starter that we can be confident is going to do a great job with making bread, but also is safe to use. I'll tell you a little story, just while I think of it. When I first started making sourdough bread, I watched a lot of videos on how to do it, and obviously I didn't have a sourdough starter, so I watched a lot of videos as well on how to make your own sourdough starter. And one of the videos that I liked, there were a few that actually were the same, but he said all you need to do is you mix flour and water together, mix it up nicely, leave it for a day. And then the next day you come on, you discard half of it, you mix some more in, and you mix it together to replace what you've taken out and mix it together, and then you leave that for another day, and then the next day you discard half, feed it back up to what it was again, mix it together, let it ferment for another day, and just keep that process going every day. And then after about day 6, when you see that there's lots of bubbles in your starter, then it will be fine to use. And looked okay to me. I didn't really know any different, so I did exactly that. And I went through that process, and after 6 days I looked at my starter. It seemed to be nice and bubbly, and so I thought, great, I'm ready to make bread, and away I go. Well, I made my first loaf of bread, and actually it wasn't such a bad loaf of bread, because I had been watching a lot of videos and reading a lot of stuff on how to make sourdough bread, and it turned out okay. And I promptly ate a fair bit of it, and tasted pretty good too. But a few hours later that night, I wasn't feeling very well at all. I actually had a bad case of diarrhea and felt like gastro, and it wasn't good at all. And I thought, what the heck's going on here? I tried to think of all the things that I'd eaten. The only thing that I could think of that I'd eaten that I didn't know why it might cause it, but could, was my sourdough bread. And I thought, there's something gone wrong here. Shouldn't be the case. But anyway, look, my daughter is, she's a PhD in biotechnology, and she was doing her PhD at that time, and she was doing a lot of work in fermenting and creating cultures with different bacteria and so on as part of her studies. And I talked to her about it, and I said, this is what I'd done, and that I was feeling sick, and what could it be? She said, based on what you're saying, it sounds as though there was still a fair bit of toxin left over from some of the bacteria that was in that sourdough starter. And she explained to me what I did to you about the fact that there are good guys and bad guys, and that they don't always automatically disappear. Within a few days, it takes time to get the process really going to get the starter friendly, if you like. And so I thought, oh, gee, that's not good. And I had no idea about that. I said, look, all those bacteria, they're going to die when I bake the bread. So how can they survive that? She said, no, it's not the bacteria that is causing you the sickness. It's the toxins they produce as they're going through that metabolization process. One of those byproducts is the toxins. And she said often that the sickness that you get from bacterial infection is not the bacteria themselves, it's the toxins that they emit, give off, is actually as much a problem, if not more of a problem. So I thought, oh, gee, obviously that video wasn't quite right. So I just got my sourdough starter. I extended it on for another 3 or 4 days, as she recommended. She said at least 2 weeks. And then I used it again, and everything was fine, and it's been fine ever since. And I have to move the camera to do this, but I'll show you what my starter looks like now, and I think you'll see it's very alive and bubbly, and looks really great. So let me do that. Okay, so I'm trying to get the best shot I can of that starter. As you can probably see, it's really nice and bubbly, and really alive, and frothy, and it smells just amazing. It's got this really beery wine, sort of like a winey smell, but it's also got a floralness to a fragrance. It's almost like a tropical fruit cocktail in a lot of ways, because this was fed only Yesterday morning I fed that, and it's actually been in the fridge. It came to what I call a blooming stage. It doubled in size at least, and it's been in the fridge ever since. But I got it out just about an hour ago, and it's still got a bit of growth left that it's going through, and it's really nice, and that would make just a beautiful loaf of bread. So that's a sourdough starter that's at its peak, and I've had this starter going now for about 6 years, and it's really, really nice, makes lovely bread. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is just to go through a description of exactly what you do and what I recommend that you do to make a really good sourdough starter. And actually it's a little bit different for those who have done my class in the past. It's a little bit different to what I have taught in my classes. I've been doing a fair bit of research in preparing for this series. I've gone back over some of the things that I've been doing and teaching, and just researching a little bit more and trying to refine the processes so that I can give you the very best information that I can. And what I used to do and what I used to teach is exactly what I described to you a little while ago about what I'd been told from a lot of people that made, a really good sourdough bread. And that was that you start with a container, and you just mix equal parts of flour and water together, and mix them and leave them for a day, and then you come back and discard some and mix in some more to make it up to the original level, and so on and so on and so forth. I don't quite do it that way. It's pretty much the same, but with a couple of differences. So here we go. This is what you do. So the first thing is to get a container that's food safe, a decent sized jar, or in my case, I use these. This is a plastic. It's a food-safe plastic container. Some people get a bit funny about plastic, saying it gives off all these gases and things and nasty chemicals. Yes, that can be true when these plastics are brand new, but after a while they've finished giving off all of their byproducts, and if you've had them for any length of time, they're perfectly fine. Glass is perfectly safe. It's great. And anything stainless steel, a pot or a jar or anything like that is perfectly safe as well. But so is plastic. As long as it's not brand new, it'll be perfectly fine. I like these because it's got a nice wide open mouth. It'll hold a fair bit, about half a kilo of starter when I've mixed it up. And I use that, I bake quite a lot, not only at home for myself and sometimes for customers. I don't do a lot of baking for other people anymore. I did when I first started. But when I teach my classes, I have to have a fair bit of starter that I can use as a seed amount to make a big batch that I can then give some to everybody in the class. So I like to use these containers. Also, on the odd occasion that you're a bit fumble fingers like I am sometimes, if you drop this, you're not going to end up with shards of glass all through your starter, so you can quite safely salvage what's left in there after you've dropped it and continue on with no fear that you've got little tiny slivers of glass in your starter jar. Not that that's a big problem and that happens a lot, but it can happen. So that's another reason why I like these plastic containers. But whatever you use, it just needs to be food safe, and it just needs to be big enough so that it contains the amount of starter that you're going to reasonably need for the baking that you do. And usually a couple of 100 mils, 200 grams or so of starter, 200 to 300 grams is adequate, more than adequate for what most people would need if you're baking, once a week or even twice a week. Okay, so we've got our container. Now we need some flour. What sort of flour do you use? My recommendation is to use a mixture of plain flour, or what Americans you call it all-purpose flour, and bread flour. So a mixture of that, or one or the other, because it really doesn't matter how much protein content there is in the flour that you use to make your starter. So you could use all-purpose flour, a lower lower protein type flour or bread flour, doesn't really matter. But I also like to add, say, in a 50-50 mix of whatever you use, with wholemeal flour. And the reason why I like to use wholemeal flour in it, or also rye flour is very good for this as well, is that wholemeal and rye, which is normally milled as a wholemeal flour anyway, they carry a lot more of the natural yeasts and bacterias on the grains of wheat and rye, for instance, that they, as they grow, the yeasts and bacteria accumulate on the grains, and then when they mill that, it retains a lot of that in there. Whereas with white flour, a lot of that bran is filtered out, is sifted out, and it has less of it. You can still use plain white flour, but a wholemeal or rye, 50-50 with white flour is probably the ideal. It just kicks off the process to get you off to a good start with your sourdough starter. Okay, so how much do we use? My recommendation would be that you start out with a mix of 50 grams of water by weight. So you use a scale, preferably a good electronic scale that can measure to within 1 gram. So 50 grams of water, 50 grams of flour, so 25 grams only of plain white, and 25 grams of wholemeal or rye. Mix that thoroughly together so it'll become fairly a bit like a sort of thick pancake batter in mixture. And then you clean down the sides of the jar to make sure that there's not too much sticking to the sides of the jar, because that can invite things like mold into your mix if it's around. And then you just cover that and leave it. And you, instead of touching that at all within a day, I recommend that you'd leave it for about 2 to 3 days until you start to see some bubbles forming in that mix. So you can see that the fermentation process is just beginning. Not that it's nice and frothy and bubbly like it was in the starter that I use now, but that you're starting to see some evidence of the fermentation process beginning. And that will allow time so that mixture of yeast and bacteria will expand enough so that you're getting off to a good start. Whereas if you discard some too early, you're going to weaken the starter instead of strengthening it. So that's a little bit of a change to what I used to do. So anyway, once you start to see that fermentation process begin, and that might be as little as a day, because if it's fairly warm in your kitchen, say, I'm talking Celsius now, 25 degrees Celsius, that's going to provide a lot of energy for that microbe mix to get going, because heat does encourage microbial action a lot. Whereas if it's really cold in your kitchen, 18 degrees or less, it's going to be quite slow. So it could be 3 days, but it could be anywhere from a day to 3 days until you start to see that action. Okay, so once you're starting to see that fermentation beginning to happen, it doesn't have to be really obvious, but it should be there, and that's why using a glass container is good in this case. Then you discard most of it, 80% of it. So you're only left with a little bit left, and it doesn't matter. You don't have to measure exactly how much, but it's about a tablespoonful in the bottom of the container. Okay, and then what we do is we add another 50 mils of water and 50 grams of your flour in a mixture. So, it's a bit of a it's a chemistry job to get that mixture right, and it doesn't have to be perfect, but 1-to-1 is about the best ratio between water and flour to make it a nice, manageable mix, and not too dry and not too wet. So you mix it again, and then you leave it again for until you see that fermentation again begin to develop. And it might be again a day, 2 or even 3 days that you're doing that. And then repeating that every time you see that fermentation action becoming obvious. It'll get more and more and more. And after a period of about 10 days, your starter should start to rise pretty quickly when you feed it. You know, within a period of 5 to 6 hours, it should rise pretty quickly. And that's when a lot of people think, oh, great, that's it, that's done, the starter's finished, I can use it now. But it's probably best if you then continue that process on of discarding and refeeding for another, 3, 4, 5 days until you see that you get that not only the nice and bubbly increase in the starter, but also you get a nice fresh, but it's sort of like a fermenty, beery smell. There's no off smell like dirty socks or smelly cheese or anything like that. It's a fairly clean smell, and that'll indicate that it's also pretty safe. Another thing you can do, and it's not dangerous to do this, towards the end of the process when you're just checking to see what it's like, you can actually taste a bit of it. Get a bit on your fingertip, give it a taste, and it'll sort of taste like floury yogurt because the bacteria that cause the acid in the starter are pretty much the same as produce the lactobacillus is what it's called. They're the same as what's in yogurt. And in fact, some people use fresh yogurt as a bit of a stimulant a little bit early on in the process of making sourdough starter, but you don't need to. It's just a way of checking towards the end. But once your starter is nice and bubbly, it rises to at least double within sort of 4 to 6 hours, then you can start to use your starter. Now, a couple of things that can happen when you're making your starter. There might come a period halfway through making your starter where it sort of seems to go dormant, where it doesn't seem to get bubbly at all. Now, there's nothing wrong with that. What happens is pretty complex, what's going on in your starter, and it may be that for a period of time, there's a real battle going on in that mixture between the different types of bacteria and yeasts and so on. And for a period, the bacteria might gain the upper hand for a little while and suppress some of that airiness. But eventually, your starter will end up being quite a good and useful starter and in a really good condition. So don't be worried too much if it either goes a little bit flat for a couple of days, or if it gets excessively frothy too. Early on, I'm talking about 5 days, it's really frothy. Don't assume that now it's finished, because that's also another indication of that battle that's going on in your starter. And in this case, the yeasts are predominating, but you haven't yet got that nice balance between the two. So there's a bit more than that. That still is only a fairly kind of introduction to what's going on in starters. It's a lot more complex than that, but essentially that's what's going on. But the main thing is give it time for that starter to develop properly. Don't be impatient. Let it work. Now, if you're watching this video and you're now going to go and put that into practice, go right ahead. And if you run into any problems, just let me know and we'll talk through it. With everything I do, whether it be a face-to-face class or whether it be on this medium here, I always offer myself as an ongoing, if you like, consultant. There might come a limit to that. If I've got thousands of people watching this video, I might get overwhelmed, but that won't happen for a start. And just feel free to contact me. Just feel free to say, look, I've tried what you did and this is happening and it doesn't seem to be working. We'll work through it. But I've never failed to revitalise a starter that's been misbehaving if I've been given the opportunity to help out, and we can always troubleshoot it. All right, and if the worst comes to worst and it doesn't work, then there's other alternatives as well. If you don't even want to go through the process of making your own starter, there are starters available on Facebook, for instance, Facebook Marketplace. There's lots of people selling starters. If you know a bakery that makes sourdough bread, they'll sometimes sell you some starter. You can even buy powdered, dried starter from places like some health food shops or online. There's lots of alternatives. But if you can make your own, then you're learning a lot about the whole process that's going to help you when you come to bake your own bread as well. So there you have it. That's an introduction to how you make a sourdough starter. In the next video, we're going to start to talk about how you use your sourdough starter and how you can use it to bake bread. So it'll be a few videos down the track before we actually start making bread, but these things are so important as a foundation. So I hope you've enjoyed this, and love your comments if you've got any suggestions or questions or things you think that I haven't covered or things you think that I might have gotten wrong. I'm always learning as well. But I'll see you in the next video when we're going to start to talk about how you can actually use the starter that you've made and go from there. Okay, see you next time.